Hello everybody, and welcome to this little video of mine. For those of you that have watched the past couple that I've done, you'll notice that they're kind of very disconnected in terms of their subject matter, but I guess that's not a problem. This particular one is about a subject that I think is fascinating. It's about diaspora in America, to put it simply. For example, as one video I found put it, why do a lot of Americans consider themselves Irish? That's only one example. It can apply to Americans that consider themselves Irish or Italian, Scottish, Welsh, German, French, Spanish, Russian, English, Polish, or really any number of things. But I'm speaking particularly right now in terms of people that identify with European ancestry. So why do Americans feel this way? And I should point out that this can also apply in many ways to people in Canada, Australia, and New Zealand as well, because like the United States, they have a very, what one would call, diasporic history. Basically, it's possible in most countries to be ethnically tied to your land of origin, that is, genetically or ancestrally, in terms of an actual bloodline. What I mean is this: if you're an American, you can't really consider yourself to be ethnically American unless, of course, you are a Native American. That's because if you're not Native American, your ancestors came from somewhere else. And this goes for people that are white, people that are black, people that are Latino, Middle Eastern, Asian, or whatever. But as I said, I'm speaking particularly right now about people that are of European descent in America, and why they feel the way they do about connections, I guess, to their European heritage. It's probably a multifaceted issue, but speaking from personal experience or from just my personal opinion, this is probably the best way to describe it. In countries in Europe, for example, many of them have immigrants. Most countries all over the world have immigrants. But focusing particularly on countries in Europe, particularly in Western Europe, there are massive immigrant communities in places like England and France and Spain and Germany and Holland, and we all know those countries. In fact, there's a lot of upheaval in Europe right now because of a lot of that, unfortunately. But here's the difference. Immigrants are living in those countries, yes, it's very true. However, in those countries, for example, if someone is from England, it is possible to be ethnically English, culturally English, nationally English, geographically English. And again, this does not apply to the United States, to Canada, to Australia, or New Zealand, which were founded by diasporic or wandering exile populations. It is not possible to be an ethnic person of those countries unless you are descended from the Native Americans or perhaps the Aborigines that you found in those places centuries ago. Obviously, this means that most Americans don't fit into that category, and for the duration of this video I'll be speaking about Americans, since that's the place where I live. Most Americans don't fit into the category of being Native American anymore because of centuries of cultural assimilation and much warfare and bloodshed. But it can be seen that way because if you're an American, obviously for most of us you have a place of origin that is different than this country. Not you personally perhaps, but your name, your family, however far back it might go. It might go back one generation, or in the case of many parts of my family, it might go back 10. I'll give you an example for one reason. If I were to go to Ireland and say that I was Irish, they would think I was nuts, because I'm not from Ireland. I wasn't born there, I wasn't raised there, I haven't even set foot there. So obviously, of course, I'm not an Irish person. I'm not an Irish national. I am not culturally Irish. I do have a fair amount of Irish ancestry, but that's not surprising. Most Americans do. But my last name, for example, is from Northern England, so I have a lot of English as well as some other things. Same thing, if I were to go to England and say I was English, they wouldn't think of me that way because I'm from here, I'm from America. And they'd be right. I'm not English. I'm not Irish. Not in the sense that I have an actual physical connection and personal link to those countries. I am proud of those aspects of my ancestry, and they fascinate me greatly, but I am not one of them in that sense at all. I'm an American. But why do Americans look at themselves this way? Well, here's the thing. I think because it's not possible for many Americans to be ethnically American, they try to find a place of origin. They try to find something to hang on to. It's true that America has its own culture and its own values, but America is a young country. It's only 235 years old, give or take. Whereas England, Italy, I mean, these are very old countries. And of course, those are the origins, for example, of people's last names. So you'll find people that say, oh, my family name's from England, I'm English. My family name's from Ireland, I'm Irish. Again, that's not a completely correct statement, but that's kind of why people do it. I think it's because a lot of Americans want to have something else to hold on to, because even though there's a lot of uniqueness in American culture, they want a connection to something that is older and more established and more respected in the world, and something that is more powerful. That said, I mean, you could look at the fact, the roundabout fact that, you know, rock and roll is an American phenomenon, yet it took British singers to make rock and roll big in America. So it took British people to make American music big in America, really, as a mainstream thing. But there has always been that sort of cultural exchange. But as to why Americans consider themselves to be of those places of origin, I think it is the problem of diaspora, because if you're not ethnically American, you might be culturally, nationally, politically, all that other stuff that I mentioned, and that's important. But if you're not ethnically American, that does leave a bit of a question in your ancestry, a question as to who you are culturally. That leaves a little part of it open, so people in America identify themselves with aspects of their culture. I don't think it's bad that Americans see themselves in that way, but I think Americans also need to have the distinction that says, for example, if an American person says, I'm Irish, unless they are themselves from Ireland or their parents are both from Ireland or something like that, it doesn't apply in the same way. They may have ancestral ties to Ireland in some capacity, or to other countries, like me or many others, but it's probably better for them to say that they have ancestry from such and such a place rather than they are of such and such a place, because it's more clear. America is a distinct culture, but it is not an ethnicity. And this has been the case throughout all history, really. I mean, when you look at the Normans when they invaded England in 1066, at that time, England was ruled by the Anglo-Saxons, groups of people that were themselves tribesmen from Germany and Denmark. And they had taken it from the Britons, the British Celts. But, for example, the Normans were Norsemen. They were Vikings who settled on the coast of France, a place called Normandy now, obviously for their name. And they went across the English Channel, they went into England, and they conquered it. These Normans considered themselves French. They did not consider themselves to be English. They spoke French, they ate French food, they followed French customs, they had French education. Many of their parents and grandparents were French, and so they associated themselves as being French people rather than being English people, because the Anglo-Saxons were peasants. They were farmers, and they were the conquered. And the Norman conquerors would never have identified themselves as being French. However, this also applies to the fact, after several generations, Norman people who were born in England saw themselves as being more French than English, even though people in France, people in places like Aquitaine, people in places like Flanders, or even Paris especially, those people didn't consider those Normans to be French. They considered them to be English because they were born in England. Despite the fact that Normans born in England spoke French and were culturally French. The Normans did not really consider themselves to be English people until after 1215, the Magna Carta, which basically cut off England from Europe, and the Normans became finally fully anglicized. So there again, you have an immigrant community, which in some ways, similar to America, came by conquest and developed its own culture, but took certain elements with it, and they identified themselves as being part of their place of origin, and not simply the country from which they themselves might have been, but the countries from which their parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, and great-great-grandparents, and so on might have been from. It is an attempt to harken back to the old, proud aspects of ancestry. I think that's why a lot of Americans see themselves that way, because, again, America is such a young country, it's such a small speck on the world history table, and really there's, so much more connection and so much more depth to the cultures, I think, in many ways, of other countries because of their longevity. I suppose longevity is a good word. But as to why Americans do it, I think those are some of the reasons. To recap, you can't be ethnically American, but you can be nationally and politically and culturally and geographically American. If you're from a country in Europe, you can ethnically be of that country. You can't do that in the Americas. You can't do it in Australia or New Zealand. And of course, when people do that, they're going to want to look back, because there is a piece of their history missing, a piece of their ancestry missing. And they're going to want to look at perhaps where their surname comes from, where their parents were from, where their grandparents were from, because they're going to want that deeper connection. I think in a way, it's a bit of a uniquely American phenomenon for the most part. And I understand why other people in Europe, for example, wouldn't agree with it. But it is, I think, an understandable thing, given what I've spoken about here. But anyway, these are my 2 cents. I'm not saying that I'm absolutely correct, and I'm sure that it's a much more multifaceted issue than I've portrayed it, and I'm sure it's much deeper, but these are just my 2 cents on the subject as I've seen it so far. So, thanks very much for watching, and if you have any comments or would like to reply, please feel free. And thanks a lot. Take care.